Hi everyone. It's been a long time since I've made anything for YouTube. I've primarily been focused on other projects. Right now I'm writing a book about sexuality in media, specifically sex positivity. And if I'm not doing that, I'm illustrating my concepts in my artistic output. So that tends to keep me busy. I also came out recently, so while people on this channel might remember me as the 2 cents guy, I'm a trans woman now, and it might not seem visually apparent just because I'm not someone who's very good at putting thought into my physical appearance. So, in terms of gender performance, I'm a bit lacking. But at the end of the day, it's how I identify. And if you read my writing or you look at my artistic output, it's a little bit more obvious. But if you're just looking at me or you're hearing the sound of my dulcet voice, then yeah, I still pass as cis het. But as things are, I'm out and I'm trans. So calling me the 2 cents guy, I know that 2 cents is or I know that guy is kind of a gender neutral term. You can call girls guys, for instance, but I'd rather not be called guy anymore. 2 cents girl is preferable to me. Um, I haven't really been doing very much as far as metal goes or music more generally, except to respond to Andy Curate's videos, and every once in a while, maybe some other YouTuber who has a Metallica remaster of sorts. And sometimes I'll weigh in, but usually it's just with Andy's videos. Um, and I wanted to try something a bit different. I wanted to try something of a response video to Metallica's new single, Lux Aeterna. And I'm not one to do reactionary videos. However, it's something that I wanted to try recently as I felt intimidated returning to YouTube to make regular content because in the past I would primarily do video essays that require a lot of editing and time and energy, and I didn't feel like I necessarily had any of that to offer in terms of making new video essays, writing a book, and I'm doing a lot of illustrations to expand my portfolio and my website and all of that. So I'm not fully invested in doing anything quite that complicated, but I thought, well, if I'm just reacting to videos, which I see much larger YouTube channels than myself, like Shred or Rob Beto, people like that, where these guys are professionals, but the amount of effort that they're putting in their videos amounts to they point a camera at themselves, they have the music on the screen, and then they play it and talk about it. There's another channel too I like that really does it. It's a composer who listens to different stuff, and has like perfect pitch, and he can sing and hear the individual notes and analyze them compositionally, and that's really cool. I don't have that kind of skill, but you have the point being is that you have a lot of different pros and seasoned vets that are basically just doing reactions to music that they've never heard before. And I'd love to do that. I love heavy metal. I love other kinds of music as well, but I grew up on metal, Metallica in particular. And then in the early 2000s, when I was in high school, iTunes was a thing, and which dates me. But for $1 a song, you could buy music and sort of own it, even though it was the MP3s were like locked and controlled. You could only listen to them on like iPods or other Apple produced things that were like certified by Steve Jobs. You know, it was all heavily privatized. And incidentally, Metallica themselves were no strangers to that type of scandal, wherein Napster was something that they fought against tooth and nail because they wanted to make money off their music, which to an extent I understand, but at the end of the day, I feel like a lot of people look at Metallica like they're the godfathers of heavy metal, not just thrash, but like metal more generally, because a lot of people, their first exposure to metal is through Metallica, and they think, all right, this must be where it started, when point in fact, Metallica ripped off a lot of stuff from other older bands like Deep Purple or Merciful Fate or Saxon, the new wave of British heavy metal. And that's something that I like to keep in mind when listening to Metallica now, is my opinion of them is a lot more moderate or grounded than I think a lot of people are when talking about Metallica. And usually it's Metallica versus Megadeth or one of the other big four. But the fact of the matter is, I'm someone who listens to like the new wave of traditional heavy metal or the new wave of thrash metal that you see on various YouTube channels that promote a lot of new metal bands, like metal that's being made now around the world in different countries besides just the United States, Greece, Portugal, Russia, and just other places where you don't tend to think of the metal scene as being quite as strong, and yet there's this huge desire to make music like that. So when I listen to Metallica, yeah, I remember the good old days, like the first 4 or 5 albums I think are pretty good for what they are. But really, even with Metallica, the first album was basically pure thrash. And then after that, they started to inject progressive elements until you got to the Black Album. And then they started writing their music more for radio play and selling out, as it were, slowing their songs down, being much more hook oriented, a lot less aggressive, an emphasis on, you know, a slick, glossy production. And you can hear that in every aspect of their creative process, from the way that James sings, to the speed at which they play their instruments, to the lyrics, to the guitar solos, just everything, really. And I think that's something that we'll see in this video, too, where even though my impression was, okay, they sound faster than some of their mid-90s output, for instance, but at the end of the day, they don't sound as fast as their thrash stuff, and they don't sound as aggressive either. It's almost like hearing Kill 'Em All Light or something like that. And I've heard a lot of people like comparing this song to Kill 'Em All, and when I heard that, I'm like, okay, I can hear the blues, like double stops, for instance, and just the general sort of like double bass drum that's playing, like the double kick, which Lars is using for the first time in literally decades, it feels like. I know he used it on Hardwired to Self-Destruct to some extent, you know, and it's used sparingly, but here it's like, you know, very much front and center. It's just a part of the song. It's not just something that he does for 2 seconds. And I think that's cool. That's neat. But it still feels like thrash light, or even like the progressive light. Because Metallica I never really considered to be a full-on thrash band, except for like the first album. And then with Ride the Lightning, it starts getting a lot more progressive right away. And by the time you get to And Justice for All, it's like pure prog. You know, there's very little thrash at all. Like, there are like thrash sections, but not really just full-on thrash songs, even with that album. Or Master of Puppets, like Damage Incorporated, is a pretty thrashy song. But even with that, like, you have the slow sections where you have to build up to the fast part. It doesn't just kick off thrashing from beginning to end. In any event, I suck at keeping things short, and I'm already starting to ramble. So I thought what we would do here is listen to this, and just from start to finish, I'll comment throughout the song and just kind of give my basic impressions. They're not my first impressions. I've heard the song several times. I've heard other people talk about it, but I just wanted to comment on it as I was listening, and then we'll go back and listen to it again, and I'll break down things a bit more thoroughly. So without further ado, here we go. Alright, the production values are sort of standard. again, the double kick drum that Lars is using. The music videos don't really seem... It seems fairly standard. That left-hand guitar, and then the other instruments joining in for that full sound. The whole band is playing now. It has kind of a bluesy rock feel to it, sort of like Kill 'Em All, but again, Kill 'Em All light. Not really a lot of tom usage from Lars. A little bit, but not really. Again, his drum style, while including the double kick, is still kind of dialed back. And again, James is singing higher than he might normally, less of a baritone and more of a higher range for him, but he still sounds like, again, a mix between old and new. Obviously, I prefer old James in terms of his vocals. He was less grimy back in the day and just more pissed off. And you have the harmonized sort of chorus there. That sort of start-stop, the band interacting back and forth. And I like the lasers and the smoke, just the non-musical elements. Kirk's solo is kind of a mess, honestly. Like, it starts off with a little bit of, like, tremolo, alternate picking, that kind of thing. But then it mostly just devolves into a bunch of, like, messy string bends. Like, it sounds like a Slayer solo. Like a Kerry King solo, almost, except not as, like, morbid. And the problem with Kirk is I'm going to compare it to his old solos. Like, he was taught by Joe Satriani, and if you listen to And Justice for All in particular, you can really hear that. Whereas here, it sounds like he's forgotten how to play that particular style. With the Black Album, he wanted to lean into more of a bluesy style and a simpler style, if we're being honest. And here it just sounds like he doesn't have what it takes to even revive some of his former guitar wizardry. There's that little sort of refrain, the full speed or nothing, the harmony. It's like, yeah, it's okay, but it's just kind of basic, really. And the production, I will say, I like the double bass is very constant throughout the song, and the overall production is good. Relatively speaking. I'll get more into that in a second. And this is the coda, right? And then they end with that final Lux Aeterna kind of thing. Alright, so I have a lot of different thoughts and feelings about this. One thing that I wanted to sort of talk about was the idea of the title, Lux Aeterna, where when I heard it originally, I thought he said Lucky Eternal, or Lux Eternal, like luck, Lucks. And that's the problem when you have a dead language like Latin, where it's homophonic, and you're not going to assume Latin when you hear it. It's like when you're in Central Park, you don't think zebras when you hear hoofbeats. And it's not a phrase that you hear in common parlance. There are some Latin expressions that you do hear, like mea culpa or post hoc, something like that, generally like on the debate floor or in a court of law. But Lux Aeterna just isn't something I recall hearing before. So when I hear it, I automatically think of something in English that I would hear, and it doesn't really make any sense. And that's kind of the problem when your chorus, your refrain, is literally a non-idiomatic Latin expression in a dead language. And furthermore, how is he supposed to pronounce it? It's a dead language. It doesn't really matter because the language is dead. So I feel like the song should give you some idea of what the Latin means, but I have no idea. All I remember from James's singing is full speed or nothing in a harmonized, uh, when he's harmonizing with himself, it sounds like, or the backup vocals with Rob, and it doesn't. I have no idea what it means, and I just get the feeling like they're appealing to a younger generation, like with Stranger Things, where just like Kate Bush's song "Running Up That Hill" was basically put into the #1 spot as a chart topper like 40 years later. Suddenly you have, 1986's Metallica, that's when I was born, uh, their song Master of Puppets on the album of the same name. uh, that song is brought back into the limelight, and I feel like with this song they're trying to tap into that, and you have sort of a thrash light, which is funny because Metallica, after their first album, Kill 'Em All, already felt kind of thrash light, anyways, because they became increasingly progressive and, shedded the thrash elements. And I feel like it worked best with Ride the Lightning. Like, Ride the Lightning is the best of both worlds. You have just the right amount of prog stuff, just the right amount of thrash stuff, and the heaviness is there. If I had to tweak a couple of production things, I would. But you could say that about all the classic Metallica albums. Every Metallica album from the 80s has some type of production problem. Uh, Ride the Lightning, the drums are kind of noisy, and and and, and they almost sound kind of smothered. And in Master of Puppets, things sound a little bit too brass heavy. And with, obviously, And Justice for All, I feel like the production is bone dry. There's no bass. The drums click more than they pound, and it sounds almost like a drum machine unintentionally, and it's not good. But Ride the Lightning, if I had to pick one album that really sort of checks all the boxes and makes the least amount of mistakes and just feels the most cohesive and works the best as an album, it would be my favorite. And I'm just saying that to give you an idea of why I feel the way I do about this particular song. So all that being said, the effect here isn't just like Kill 'Em All light, because like the string bends and just that drive ahead kind of beat, it feels like a light version of Metallica at their thrashiest. And really, it also is including elements from other albums that they did, which were increasingly less thrash. So it's like thrash light. That's kind of the effect that I'm getting. And again, they're appealing to the biggest audience possible, an age demographic which didn't grow up with Metallica, so they're reinventing themselves again, and they've been around since the 80s. 83 is when they cut their first album, but they were around before that, obviously. They were pretty young when they did that, so before that they were basically in high school. But, you have these Bay Area thrashers that listened to a lot of music and sort of did their own thing with it, like Diamond Head, Merciful Fate, Deep Purple, Saxon, bands like that. And they ripped off a lot of different stuff. I mean, they ripped off David Bowie and some more obscure sort of stuff too that most people would never have heard. And that's all good and fine. Everyone does that, and I think they did a really good job with the material. But here I feel like they're ripping off themselves, and they're doing it to an audience that is going to hear this for the first time, and they're going to be like, wow, this is going to be nostalgic to all these Zoomers who are hearing this. When, at the end of the day, what makes a song? Is it nostalgic, or is it the fact that it's just really well done? What's the difference? So, for instance, if some band other than Black Sabbath invented heavy metal or laid the groundwork for it, they were the godfathers of heavy metal, and we heard Black Sabbath today exactly as they sounded all those years ago, but they emerged as like some new band, how would I feel about it? Because when I heard them, I was in Paris. I heard it on a double disc collection of various songs, largely from the Ozzy period, except for like one song from the Dio era, Heaven and Hell. And then I went on to discover, Ian Gillan, Born Again, and the Tony Martin era, and so there were some other vocalists besides, and then where when I heard Black Sabbath, I heard them past their prime. You know, they hadn't been the original lineup, though I did hear their original lineup in 2004 at the Pine Knob in Detroit, and it was really cool to hear that original lineup with the original drummer, you know, and Geezer Butler on bass, and Bill Ward. Bill Ward was the original drummer, Geezer Butler on bass, Ayami on guitars, and then obviously Ozzy. So I got to hear the original lineup, but I had already been listening to them for a while. But let's say I hadn't had any of those experiences at all, and my own nostalgia just wasn't there, and I heard the band now. Like, it's difficult to imagine because the way that I listened to them was largely a result of me discovering them, which set me down this path. So trying to imagine some alternate universe where some other band led to the creation of similar sounding music to Black Sabbath, and then Black Sabbath just created the same music many, many years later, and then if I heard it without the nostalgia, how would I feel about it? And I feel like I would probably love it. I mean, it works really well for what it is. By today's standards, it feels kind of basic, but it has that underground, recorded in your basement kind of charm. And the compositions are relatively solid, and the players work well together. That doesn't mean that there isn't a lot to be improved upon, but if you have a bunch of bands nowadays that are trying to emulate that Black Sabbath sound, for instance, and trying to recreate it, I feel like Black Sabbath would feel pretty authentic in that Renaissance sort of mode. So bringing that back around to Metallica, you have this band that's reinventing themselves, but how does the reinvention stack up for someone like me where the nostalgia really isn't there? And I think, again, it sounds like a light reinvention of progressive thrash music, you know, something that they've done multiple times. Like they already tried to reinvent themselves in the early 2000s with Saint Anger, and then Death Magnetic, and then Hardwired to Self-Destruct, and those albums where they've constantly just played the middle ground and tried to appeal to the largest possible group. And I feel like this album isn't going to be any different, where Hardwired to Self-Destruct opened up with a very similar sounding song, a song of a similar length, where Lars is just playing, you know, a very basic repetitive drum pattern. He doesn't really get outside of his comfort zone or do any like really cool drum fills the way that he did on Kill 'Em All. That's another reason that it's kind of confusing when you listen to this song, is that it doesn't really feel like Kill 'Em All apart from the basic sound. Like, just in terms of how the players play, though, like Lars is playing much safer than he would have on Kill 'Em All. He's just a lot less expressive with his kid. So I feel like if you take away the nostalgia and you look at this just purely on the compositional merits, the merits of the players, these guys sound like a poor emulation of their former selves. And the youngsters aren't going to know that, perhaps, unless they're already listening to metal like me, and they're familiar with like the new wave of traditional heavy metal, the new wave of thrash metal, and that music tends to sound much less distilled, unadulterated. It's much more aggressive and technically proficient, and this just isn't. So it's not really that impressive. It's kind of nice. The one thing I will say is I really like the production. The audio production sounds better in terms of its fullness. It doesn't sound kind of buzzy and crunchy. And if you listen to a lot of what if Metallica sounded like this, or what if they wrote this song on this album, that trend, I think, was started because the new Metallica albums were, again, sort of on the fence about what they wanted to be, and their production kind of reflects that, where you have these songs that are written in kind of a thrash elements and prog elements, but the production didn't really ever catch up to that, and it always sounded like that hard rock sort of sound that they had in the 90s and the early 2000s, and it never really fit. and which is why you have so many bands that are like, hey, what if Spit Out the Bone was played on Kill 'Em All by Creeblestar or Ride the Lightning? And it sounds instantly better. You don't have to change anything else about the song except for maybe the solos to try and make them match the album, because you do have to change a lot of the notes and just the dynamics and the playing style. Less wah pedal and more, tapping and arpeggios and triads and harmonization and stuff like that. Just simply put, more complicated guitar playing and less of that simplified bluesy style that Kirk started to really push from the 90s onward. And here it feels like he, like I said earlier, he can't really match up to his former self. Whereas, James's rhythm style, it's slower, but I feel like if he wanted to, he could still play some of these riffs. I mean, you can hear it when they play live. Like, the one person, like, who really sounds like they don't sound radically different from the old days, at least in terms of the rhythm playing, is James. And then Rob wasn't with the band when they were older, but, he's a very technically proficient bassist. He kind of gets the short end of the stick, but then again, what bassist besides Cliff didn't get a short end of the stick? So, I mean, they only had Jason Newsted, and then there was a bassist actually very early in their career who kind of got the boot before Cliff joined, which is honestly was kind of a blessing in disguise, because Cliff was very transformative. He knew a lot about music theory, and he was just a really good bassist. I think he was very good for the band. Jason Newsted was good for the band too. If you listen to Black End, the intro to that was actually written by him. They played it backwards, which was a cool idea. But he wrote that, and so he was able to weigh in. And one of the coolest sounding things on And Justice for All, an album that's known for a lot of cool sounding things, like it's a very flashy album, was actually written by the bassist, and I like that. But at the end of the day, they totally hazed him on that album, to the album's detriment, I think. And apart from that, it was just Rob, right? Jason left the band, and then he left the band, and then it was Rob. But they treated Rob the same way for years. Rob doesn't give a fuck because they're paying him a shitload of money, so who cares? He gets to play live and people can hear him, so yeah, whatever. It's just you can't really hear him on the albums, even something like Hardwired, Death Magnetic, where they're trying to sound more thrashy. The production still suffers from that And Justice for All curse, which is something I will say wasn't present as much with Bob Rock. If you listen to the Black Album, you can hear Jason fairly well, like in songs like Holier Than Thou, where you can hear the bass line during like the break after the solo, and it sounds really good. So yeah, these are my various kind of thoughts about the band, and I guess I just wanted to listen through this one more time and just kind of connect certain things to what I've been talking about. I'll try and be quick. I don't want this to be too long. I also want these videos to be somewhat unscripted, but bear in mind the length of these is probably going to fluctuate and hopefully shrink over time. But yeah, here we go. Let's do it again. And just right off the bat, I can say that from a production standpoint, everything is very slick, very polished. Metallica, they have a lot of money. They have a very neoliberal, privatized approach to heavy metal, so they are going to basically hire the best in the business to help them make something, even something like this, which feels fairly minimalist, a dark room. Kind of reminds me of the film The Neon Demon, where you have like this dark space, but then you have like these geometric shapes that light up in various colors. I think that was by Nicholas Refn, who did that. He directed Drive, Only God Forgives, but he also did The Neon Demon. So this kind of makes me think of that, and despite the fact that, yeah, it's a dark room with just some lights and stuff, you still have the polished floor, and you have that sort of live sort of light show with lights and smoke is very much on display. So that repeating sort of figure, that for 3 bars, and like I get it. And right off the bat, like the drum sound sounds better than it did, say, on obviously on Saint Anger. The snare drum doesn't sound like it did, like a trash can. That's good. Uh, right off the bat, it's a snare, so it's not like motor breath where you hear that fill pattern where it's just like the gallop. I wish they would have started off with something like that just to let us know, hey, Lars is here and he plays things other than the snare and the crash cymbal and the hi-hat. Like, and to his credit, he does use the double kick drum here, and that's nice. I just wish that he'd have something other than the snare that he was just pushing constantly. I know it's metal. The snare is obviously important, like with blast beats and stuff like that. But again, it just feels kind of basic. I know they're trying to like shock you and stuff like that, but for someone who's listened to a lot of metal, a lot of extreme metal like Atheist or Death or Cynic, Corner, stuff like that, the Florida death metal scene, and various other bands that came much later than them, even that were inspired by them. This is nothing. And I feel like this is nothing even compared to Lars. So it's like, okay, buddy, you want to like impress me, you got to do better than this. And even compared to their last album, like Hardwired to Self-Destruct, this doesn't really feel altogether that impressive. So when I hear people comparing this to Kill 'Em All, it's like, no, it doesn't even sound that crazy compared to Hardwired, really, which is not a good sign. So that again, you have James the old man with the flying V, and he's kind of doing the Guitar Hero thing where he's just holding it, pointing it straight up to the sky, and he's letting that chord hang in the air for emphasis while Lars is doing the double kick thing. And it's like, all right, I get what they're doing. They're like, oh yeah, we're back for one last show, one last ride. We're gonna why you this time, and let it sink in for a second. And it's like, all right, cool. I like the idea. I appreciate the sentiment, but I don't necessarily think that it's like I need to see more before I feel floored. I'm not one of those people that gets hyped up just because Metallica does a show, for instance. They do that all the time. I do like the use of silhouettes here. And like you can tell it's Lars because he has that backwards cap, for instance, and you have to sort of guess who the players are based on their silhouettes. It's kind of a cool look, purely non-musical, of course, but and then the repeating figure here by James, I kind of like that. That da 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 and wow 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 wow. That it has sort of a double stop feel to it. A double stop is where you just you play two notes, on parallel strings, and you create like a major third, and that has a distinct sort of bluesy sound to it, and very very simple, but it was something that Metallica would do more back in the day with their riffs. They had sort of a blues rock feel, like with thrash elements, something borrowed from like Merciful Fate or Black Sabbath or Judas Priest, bands like that had already been doing it for a while. And the way they went about it, it had a similar kind of a malevolent kind of sound, like this is evil sounding, because there are different ways to play blues, and some blues really doesn't have that wicked, like devilish kind of sound. Like that's very much a more modern approach to the music, I think, than say like the blues earlier in the 20th century. So by the time the 70s and 80s came around, this was during the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, and then after that, and then in the 80s, you had neoliberalism, and Ronald Reagan or Margaret Thatcher, both of them, lasted pretty much throughout the decade in their respective countries. And metal, primarily written by white people, was a response to their policies from a white point of view, and very much had sort of a devilish component to it, which again was lifted basically straight from Black Sabbath. Their first album was in 1970, I believe, 1970, 71, thereabouts. But so that was something that Metallica was doing with their own music. They were copying, and repackaging and making their own thing out of old material. And I always thought that was kind of cool. And here Metallica's doing it yet again. And again, I can hear like traces or touches of it, but I very much want something more than just an echo or a suggestion. I want something to really go deep into what it used to be and not just like hint at. So far, not really. And there's not really a lot of time to have a deep exploration because the song is so short. If they were more technically proficient, I might say, okay, this is enough time. But something tells me, you know, even if I heard this song for the first time, I'm like, okay, let's cut to the chase, gentlemen. And that's kind of the problem is like, all right, they have that suggestion of their glory days with that bluesy kind of double stop sort of riff, and yet they're repeating it. You know, they did it once and the camera's rotating, and then it's literally a repeat where they're just doing the same section again, as if it's so impressive all on its own, like, oh boy, this is a return to form. But they've already had like multiple returns to form, and so it just feels like it doesn't go anywhere. A sea of heartbeat is one unified, like, anticipation, domination, like that rhyming scheme from Black End, where again you're ending with words. You have the suffix shun, you know, destruction, and various other words. I'm sort of blanking on other words, but you get the idea. Like I remember where he said masturbation on sort of the. They had a particular live recording, live shit binge and purge, where he was sort of making fun of his own rhyming scheme, where you have all these words and would shun during Black End, and he just swapped one of them out with masturbation. And it's like, okay, so he was making fun of himself back in the 80s / early 90s, and but here he's returning to that rhyme scheme instead of, you know, songs like Fight Fire with Fire. A song like Fight Fire with Fire, where you have the gods laugh as our lungs fill with the hot winds of death, something like that, doesn't really rhyme as much. There's less of a reliance on a basic rhyme scheme, but it's much more vivid in terms of the picture that it's trying to convey. And here, again, I have no idea what they're singing about. Approaching thunder, awaiting the light, the flash of lightning. So again, it's very, very vague stuff. Like, what is the thunder? Does that have something to do with Lux Aeterna? Like, again, the visuals. I mean, music videos often tend to be visually detached from their content, but in this case, I have no idea what he's singing about. It's just vague. And in the old days, that wasn't the case. Like, especially on Ride the Lightning, every song was distinct. Fight Fire with Fire was nuclear war. Ride the Lightning was about execution. In the Electric Chair, then you had For Whom the Bell Tolls, which was based off the novel by Ernest Hemingway. Fade to Black was a suicide limit. Trapped Under Ice was about claustrophobia, just kind of a general sort of feeling, I guess. Escape was about like prison abuse. Creeping Death was about one of the plagues, you know, the plagues of Egypt, that kind of thing. And then Call of Cthulhu was based off, you know, Lovecraft. So every song has a distinct feel. The same goes for, it's not quite as fleshed out on Kill 'Em All, I think, but a lot of the songs are pretty clear. Like Jump in the Fire, what's the fire represent? I'm not really sure, but what does Phantom Lord? It's kind of hokey, but it's also something that I think James wrote when he was in high school. It was actually based off a band that he was in before Metallica, and he went on to create Metallica, and they kept the song. And like I get what the song is about. Or the Four Horsemen's a really obvious example. Metal Militia, you know, some of it's kind of dorky, but a lot of the songs tended to be pretty abundantly clear in terms of what they were about. Sanitarium, Master of Puppets is a little harder to figure out, but if you listen to it, you can figure out the meaning of the lyrics. Cut your breakfast on a mirror, I will run through you, now I rule you too, that kind of thing. And admittedly, when I heard Master of Puppets and I heard some of these things, I didn't understand what the song was about immediately, but songs like Sanitarium and Master of Puppets, I feel like things get lyrically less clear as time goes on. And then with the Black Album, things are still not, like, James has never been what I would call a wordsmith, but I feel like with the Black Album, like Through the Never or Don't Tread on Me, certain songs like that, like I have an idea of what they're singing about. Really, Ride the Lightning is sort of like peak James, where it's like, okay, every song is like super distinct. That's not true here. Here, I really have no idea what they're singing about. It's like lightning. All right, well, what does the lightning represent? It feels like really, really abstract and also incredibly cliche from a metal standpoint. And you could have something like Holy Diver, which is esoteric, but also about space Jesus, supposedly. And so, like, Ronnie James Dio would have all of these songs where it's like, the eyes of the captain, they're black and blue, and like the tiger, ride the tiger, you can feel his stripes, but you know he's clean. Oh, can't you see what I mean? No, actually, Ronnie, I have no idea. And yeah, like, it doesn't really matter in his case, and finding out that it's Space Jesus, like, years after his death, like, okay, that's actually kind of fascinating. But with this, it's like cliche to the point of being vague while having equally cliche kind of symbols like darkness and lightning. Through the thunder and the lightning we come to you. I mean, that's something that Metallica sung about with Through the Mist and the Lightning, Metal Militia, so the bookend song for Kill 'Em All. Like, yeah, you have to have lightning and thunder and, that Gothic kind of symbol. But what's it connected to? What's it about? I have no idea. And note how repetitive this is, where, yes, Lars can play double kick throughout the whole song. He's been practicing, everyone. But it's almost like, okay, it's like listening to a musician who has never played before or forgot how to play and has to redo it, but then they just stick to what's safe. He doesn't really do anything but the kick pattern. And that Kill 'Em All blues riff kind of thing that they keep doing over and over, along with the chorus. Everything feels like a chorus, except that blues riff and that double kick pattern don't change really throughout the entire song. And when they do change, it feels like really basic. It's not flashy at all. I'm not really impressed. It doesn't thrash very hard. It feels like they kind of threw it together, and it's just really basic. And, if you're a kid and you're listening to this and you've never heard metal before, it might knock your socks off. And when I hear this, having just listened to a lot of other albums, like just scrolling down here, Atomic Opera, Time Warp, Judas Priest, Firepower, Zentrix, Seven Words, or Hell Toxic, makes a comeback with Dismorta, 2022. Like, any of these albums sound infinitely more impressive, just from a chops standpoint than what Metallica's doing, but also compared to their own discography. So yeah, not the more I listen to it, the more it. I mean, my first impression was basically what I'm telling you now, but it's not changing. If anything, I'm just becoming more convinced. It also looks like the lasers look like M's. I don't know, like, if I can. I don't know if I can pause this or not. I can't get it. In any event, the lasers look cool. Kindred Alliance connected inside. So again, there's this sense of you're surrounded by darkness and lightning, and don't worry, we'll unify and we'll stand strong. But just in terms of like an anthem, it feels kind of like there's a lot of like mixed metaphor and deliberately unclear language that it's already a really basic message, and yet I have to think for a second before I can sort of picture what he's talking about, which is hold hands and stand strong against the darkness. You know, he could have said that and it would have been much more clear than the language that he's using. So, you know, salvation, cast out the demons, you know, fear and doubt. In the face of this fear and doubt, you know, stand together. Against what, though? You know, like, in the old days, it would be some type of political threat or enemy. There would be some kind of statement. But here it's just super fucking vague, and anybody can attach whatever they want to it. And I really don't like that from a songwriting standpoint. It can be whatever you want it to be. And while there is a certain appeal to the Gothic monster in terms of like, well, you can assign whatever qualities you want to it, at the end of the day, that feels kind of vacuous. And that's exactly what's going on here. You know, trying to appeal to the greatest possible audience, you say the least amount of things possible. And that's just kind of lame, especially from a metal standpoint. It's supposed to be about rebellion. It's supposed to be about like, instead of like false consciousness, but like class consciousness, being aware of the atrocities that are being committed against people. But here they're not singing about like, you know, people being executed or wrongfully imprisoned or something like that. And it's just like, come on, guys. But it's fairly standard of musicians like Metallica, who are basically in it just to make money. And they've been that way for a long time. I like the way it sort of pulls back and you see him sort of like throwing his head back and howling, and he goes out of focus and it almost looks like an album cover. Like if I just had to like slap like Metallica on the screen with, you know, the name of the album, and then just have that, like, I get it. Okay. But it also kind of sums up how the album feels. Like it's just out of focus and it's like you can see James in there, but again, he's just sort of a blob, really. It's very indistinct. Lux Aeterna! So you have that little bit of shred with some double stops and string bends, and it's like, all right, that sounds like a good start, but now you're really going to wow us, right? And this is what he does next. And like for that segment, you know, this is a short solo, so you got to make it count. And those are just a lot of wasted notes where it feels like he doesn't really like string bends and dynamics and are very much an art form, and there are plenty of players that can do a lot with that. One of my favorites is really John Roth, where he's all about string bends and just using his hands to really bend the strings in a way that sounds cool, while also having the neoclassical chops of someone like Malmsteen, basically Malmsteen before Malmsteen, a fancier version of Ritchie Blackmore, someone like that. Like it's totally possible to do that, but in the case of Kirk here, he's just wiggling the string in a way where it almost sounds like a newbie who thinks, hey, this is what a cool guitar solo sounds like. But this is Kirk Hammett, you know, and once upon a time he really used to know how to play. And that descending kind of trill where it's like nah, 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 that is very much something that Kirk would do. But here it's almost like he's falling back on it. It's a crutch. And so you can hear the string bends, you can hear the messy kind of scales that he's doing along with that, and then the weird string bend kind of stuff or noodling, and then the descending sort of like trill that he does in a lot of his solos. And it just feels like a mix mash sort of bag of all of the things that all of his playing cliches that he's known for nowadays instead of an actual solo. And it's like, quick, do a solo. And he's so used to playing on autopilot that he just does literally every single trick like one after another down a checklist without trying to make it sound like a solo. And there's no melody. It doesn't really work. And like I heard Rick Beato talking about it and he's like, oh yeah, that sounds good. And it's like, why don't you suck Kirk Hammett's dick a little harder, Rick? Like seriously, it sounds like shit. And this is coming from someone who I like past Kirk. I like his solos on Kill 'Em All. I like his solos on Ride the Lightning. Don't like him as much on Master of Puppets, if I'm honest. There's just something about that album that doesn't sit well with me in terms of his soloing. But then with sorry, my phone was ringing, so I had to turn it off. But in any event, uh I feel like his solos on And Justice for All were some of my favorites. And then even with the Black album, you have some of his work on that. It still sounds pretty good, and there's like a lot of cool harmonies. I love The Struggle Within. His solo on that actually sounds pretty good. And then, throughout the 90s and the early 2000s, it's like he just forgot how to play the guitar. And there was kind of a return to form with Death Magnetic, where, okay, this sounds cool. And they didn't even have solos on Saint Anger, and they didn't really have a lot of solos on I think it was called Lucy, where they were playing with some guest artists, something like that. And in any event, the the soloing has never really been the same since the mid 90s. And it's like, again, you're supposed to impress us. It's like one of those YouTube videos. There are a lot of guitarists now that are like, you only have 20 seconds to audition for a band, and they just do like this really crazy kind of shit just to show off, or try and play a song in 20 seconds or play a solo in 20 seconds. And I feel like with Kirk, he doesn't have to audition. He's already in the band. He doesn't have to play a good solo. And sort of like Ringo, where it's like, hey, you're a member of the band. You wrote Yellow Submarine, good for you. Here, we'll put it on the fridge. That kind of thing. That's what it feels like with Kirk now, which is sad because he feels like a shell of his former self. And that sucks because I would very much welcome it if he returned to the guitar wizardry of yore. But he just doesn't have it anymore. And even musicians like Glenn Tipton versus Richie Faulkner, where if you listen to the two of them on Firepower, in Glenn Tipton's case, he has Parkinson's, and it was obviously starting to affect his playing at that point. Whereas, KK Downing in his own band, he was able to. KK's playing actually sounds really good, and just his debut album. I think it came out around the same time that Firepower did, maybe a little bit later. I forget the exact name of it off the top of my head, but the fact remains that KK Downing's playing. He's an old man, and he didn't have Parkinson's like Glenn did, and it sounds really solid. Whereas Glenn himself doesn't sound as good as Richie Faulkner does, just because Richie is a very skilled, fluid player. He has a very clean stuff. It doesn't sound like there's no wasted notes. There's no notes that are kind of scrambled together. Like, he's a very clean, fast, articulate shredder, but he also understands like harmony and melody really well, and he's just very competent. And yeah, he and Glenn still are able to kind of work together. The problem is that where you have the twin guitar attack here, James doesn't really play lead. Like, he does a couple of solos, like in Master of Puppets. I think he did the first guitar solo sort of thing. A very similar style to like Matthias Jabs and Rudolf Schechner and the Scorpions. Like, normally Jabs is the one who does the solos, the flashier stuff. And then every once in a while, like Winds of Change or maybe Still Loving You. There are various songs where you have these short little solos. Lady Starlight or Wind of Change, where Rudolf Schechner will do a solo, a slower solo, but where it gets to be tuneful, and I actually like those. But here, where you're just relying on Kirk to do the solos. And as far as I know, he doesn't have Parkinson's like Glenn Tipton does. And which he should sound, if anything, like someone like KK Downing or Richie Faulkner, or if he had someone to fall back on. But he's the lead guitar player, and he sounds like he's just lost his touch. And I'm hoping it would be cool if James did some solos too, because I remember there was uh, an extended sort of jam session that they had. It was like something in Redemption from Death Magnetic, and it had a solo by James that I think didn't make the cut in the original album. Like they had a solo, an extended solo by Kirk, but James had a solo that he did, and it actually didn't sound bad. You know, I think that James is actually a better lead guitar player than Kirk is at this point, even though he doesn't really play a lot of solos. Like, no offense to Kirk, like I don't want to bash the old man for not being able to play, but he kind of sounds like Neil Giraldo with Pat Benatar, where if you listen to their live performances, like I can't remember the last time Pat Benatar played live, but fairly recently from what I understand. But even so, like if you listen to him now compared to how he sounded back in the 80s, like he's obviously struggling. And that's the same thing here. And that's not a good look if you're trying to reinvent yourself, you know, pass yourself off as immortal, as the Godfathers, you'll never die, that kind of thing. It's a noble sentiment, to be sure. Long live rock and roll, right? But at the end of the day, it's like Kirk is really showing his age. I don't know what I'm looking at. Like, if this is actually like a studio effect, it's very kaleidoscopic. It looks cool. But at the end of the day, this type of like visual fireworks can't really distract from what I'm hearing. That holding the note at the end, where it's like, okay, I get the idea, like sort of like Marty McFly in Back to the Future, where he plays that final note and he like holds it and he has like the guitar player face, and it's like, and he's even holding the guitar like Marty is, you know, where you hold it up and you're like, it's almost like a salute, like, yeah, I totally nailed that. And like with Kirk, it's like, no, buddy, you really didn't. Like, if anything, the way that they're kind of standing and they're playing just a really basic repetitive pattern over and over, and they're posturing, like they really know how to play live in terms of like selling the performance with their bodies, but they just, it doesn't sound that impressive. It'd be like sort of the Ginyu Force, where they're a bunch of dorks, but they're all doing like these different like poses to like illustrate it, but it almost feels kind of campy at this point, like in trying to reinvent themselves for the upteenth time. Metallica, they're doing the same poses, but it seems kind of ridiculous at this point. Like, as basic as this riff sounds, I almost kind of welcome it compared to the solo, and given how basic it does sound, that's kind of a problem. The solo is what you're supposed to look forward to. You know, I should be playing air guitar to this. You know, I'm a guitarist, I play guitar myself, but that doesn't mean that I can't hear a cool song. Like if I hear Gary Holt on Black Rose by Thin Lizzy, it's like, yeah, I'm gonna air shred to that shit. And when I hear this, it's just like, I don't feel a desire to return to the solo. It's actually my least favorite part of the song, and I don't want to hear it again. And instead, I'm just left with this like really basic sort of riff pattern, and it sucks in and of itself, but it's still better than the other thing. I do like the sound of the snare. It's a huge improvement, you know, over everything else. Again, these are like basic requirements though at this point. It's like, good job, your snare sounds good. Wow. Okay. And again, the selling the performance through the performance of like one's body. So you're selling the music through the way that you express yourself. And if you look at like Kirk, you can see his face and how he's like almost has like these orgasmic kind of facial expressions, or like, oh wow, this is really intense and really profound, but it just doesn't match up with the notes that he's making with his instrument. I don't know. It just feels kind of phoned in or forced. Lightning the Nation, Lightning to the Nations by Diamond Head. It's a little nod to their roots. Little Tom Phil. I think I actually heard some toms. I kind of like the light too. It almost looks like sparks or rain. Like, I just wish the music matched up to the visuals of the music video. And this was a problem that they actually had when they did Death Magnetic. They had The Day That Never Comes, where they have like these breakdowns that they try and do. And they've never been especially good at them, but I feel like, except for, I don't know, something like Creeping Death, like I feel like in the older days they were obviously better at it. And you had songs like Blackened, where they have the breakdown or the slower section, which works really well, I think. Or something like, I never really liked Harvest or Sorrow, but you know, the slower kind of section. Like a breakdown isn't just where the music changes tempo, but it gets progressively slower and slower and slower. It breaks down. So something like Creeping Death, where you have the famous chorus during the parts where Lars is just banging the hell out of his toms, and that's a bit different than like a breakdown is where things get slower and slower and slower and slower, and then generally like you end or then you pick up again. And here it just feels kind of choppy and clumsy, and that was something they did on The Day That Never Comes, where it's like, okay, you can end the song now. And I feel like they're just like tacking these things on, and it feels kind of clumsy, frankly. Like like, ooh, yeah, that sounds good. Like they need a producer to tell them what to do, I feel like, at this point, because left to their own devices, like it's almost like they've forgotten how to play their own music. Okay, they're holding the note, and then they pick up again. Like it's like dead, like it just feels blended. And then they're all like, "Oh yeah, we totally did that, guys!" Like, and I love the visuals, like the colors. We have like the yellow and the blue and the red, the primary colors, that kind of thing. And it's like, yeah, the music video is very slick, and it works well with this kind of music. I just wish that the music itself sounded better. So yeah, I feel like this video has gone on for longer than I thought. I know that people sort of, some people anyways, appreciate my longer takes on some of this remastered stuff that like Andy Carate does, or Bryce Barilla and Creeble Star, and I Sign of Mercury, and I'd like to focus more on just like metal music that I like. I've spent a lot of time now listening to music other than Metallica, new stuff, but also old stuff like Manila Road is a band that I really loved in like grad school. I've been listening to them again, various bands from that point in my life, but also stuff that's even older than that. Like yesterday, I was listening to old 80s music with my mother, and they're like, "Hey, check out this song." They had me listen to "Stealin'" by Uriah Heep, and there was a song by Tom Petty and Stevie Nicks called "Stop Dragging My Heart Around." And that, you know, just all these music videos. And so I kind of want to revisit just some of my favorites, but talk about it just as sort of a hobby, because I'm writing all the time and I'm drawing all the time, but I need something that's just kind of fun to, you know, take my mind off various things that I have going on in my own life. And yeah, so I hope this lengthy sort of unscripted approach, I want to try and dial it back a little bit. And the next one, I'll try and cut to the chase more quickly, and just talk about the music. I'll spend less time explaining like why I'm even doing these, so it'll be shorter by virtue of that. But also it will be I'll try and go into it, picking a specific song. If you guys have requests, like, hey, what's your favorite music, or what do you think of this, or what do you think of that, I'd love to talk about it. And I know I don't really have a very big audience, but if anyone wants to participate and give me ideas, that's kind of the point of this. I want people to like come to me and say like, hey, what do you think of this? What do you think of that? Or and I'll try and think of things myself. Like, I'll probably talk about Metallica a little bit, but there's a lot of other bands that I'd rather talk about more, if I'm honest, especially nowadays, you know, because you have like Violence and Xenatrix and Toxic, thrash bands from the same era or thereabouts as Metallica, a similar location, who are just making music that's above and beyond anything that Metallica is doing nowadays. It just sounds good, even if they don't have the same star appeal, even if they're not as like famous, or the material conditions that they have and what they have access to in terms of like production and just star power. It's like I don't care about that. I just care about the music. So yeah, we'll see how that goes, and I hope you guys found this interesting. I apologize for I want to make these videos as good as I can, but also remind people that, I don't really, this is all done in one take, with like hotkeys and setting it up. So I have to work less hard to do this kind of thing, just because otherwise I get intimidated. I get anxious. I love talking about metal. I could do this all day. And if you like that, let me know. If you don't like that, let me know too, I guess. And until then, thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you later.